Imagine living in a house with 775 rooms and still feeling like you have nowhere to hide. That's not a metaphor, that's the real story of Buckingham Palace. For over 200 years, kings and queens have walked through those gold-trimmed halls, past oil paintings worth more than entire towns, through gardens the size of a small country estate. And yet, again and again, the people who lived there described the same quiet feeling. Not the loneliness of having no one around. The palace is full of staff, family, advisors, guards. Someone is always nearby. It's a different kind of loneliness. The kind you feel when everyone around you is watching, but no one really sees you. Maybe you felt something like that. Not in a palace, in a much smaller room, a meeting, a family dinner, a crowded party where you smiled the whole night and still drove home feeling completely unseen. Here's the strange part. The most powerful family in Britain built walls of gold, hired hundreds of guards, and surrounded themselves with more comfort than most of us can imagine. And still, they couldn't build the one thing they actually needed. A place to just be a person. Today, we're going inside Buckingham Palace. Not for the tourist version, not the postcard photos or the royal wedding balconies. We're going into the quieter rooms, the ones where real people, wearing crowns that weighed on more than their heads, tried to figure out how to feel okay. And somewhere in their story, you might find a piece of your own. Stay with me. This one gets personal. Let's start with a room that doesn't exist anymore. It was called the Chinese Room, built in the early 1800s during the reign of George IV. Silk wallpaper, hand-painted dragons, furniture shipped in from the other side of the world. George IV spent a fortune building it. Some historians say it cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. He wanted a place that felt like an escape, somewhere far from the pressure of ruling a country that didn't particularly like him. Here's what's interesting, though. He barely used it. Records from the palace staff at the time describe him ordering the room built, obsessing over every detail, and then avoiding it. Why would someone spend everything they had building a perfect escape, and then never actually escape into it? Think about that for a second. Because I think most of us have done a version of the same thing. You've probably had a moment like this. Maybe you saved for months for a vacation, planned every detail, told yourself, once I get there, I'll finally relax. And then you got there. And you couldn't relax at all. Your mind kept circling back to work, to messages, to the thing you were supposed to be escaping from. That's not bad luck. That's not you being bad at relaxing. That's something psychologists call the arrival fallacy, the belief that reaching a place, or a goal, or a version of yourself will automatically bring peace. It rarely does. Because peace isn't a location. It's a state you carry with you, or you don't. George IV built the most beautiful room in England, and he still carried his restlessness into it, because the restlessness wasn't about the room. It was inside him. Let's go a little further into the palace. Move forward a few decades. Queen Victoria. Most people know her as a symbol, a serious, unsmiling face on old coins, the longest-reigning monarch of her time. But there's a part of her story that rarely gets told. After her husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, Victoria withdrew from public life almost entirely. For years, she avoided Buckingham Palace. She preferred Windsor or her private estate in Scotland. Court staff at the time noted something strange. She would spend long stretches of the day simply sitting, not reading, not writing letters, just sitting in silence, sometimes for hours, in rooms that used to be filled with music and conversation. Imagine being one of the most powerful women on earth, and still feeling like grief was bigger than your entire kingdom. Here's the part that hits differently once you sit with it. Victoria wasn't avoiding people because she didn't care about her country. She was avoiding people because grief, real grief, doesn't know how to perform. And a palace, more than almost any other place, demands performance. Every hallway has an audience. Every conversation has a witness. Every emotion, even sadness, gets watched, judged, written about in newspapers. Have you noticed how hard it is to actually feel something when you know people are watching? Not just royalty, you in your own life. Maybe you've cried in a bathroom stall at work because breaking down at your desk felt too exposed. Maybe you've smiled through a family gathering while something inside you was quietly falling apart. We call this holding it together. But really, it's a kind of hiding. And the exhausting part is, the better you get at hiding, the lonelier it feels. Because the people around you start believing the performance. They stop asking if you're okay, because you look fine. You look more than fine, you look strong. Victoria wore black for the rest of her life after Albert died. Some historians believe it wasn't just mourning tradition. It was armor, a way of saying, without words, please don't ask me to smile today. For a moment, picture that. A queen, inside a palace built to project strength to the entire world, quietly asking to be left alone with her sadness. She never really got that permission. The country needed her to appear, to reign, to perform stability, even when she had none to give. So she gave what she could, and she carried the rest alone, in rooms too large for one grieving woman. There's something almost unbearably human about that. Because underneath the crown, underneath the title, underneath the portraits, she was just a person who lost someone she loved. And she didn't know where to put that pain. Neither do most of us, if we're honest. We just don't have 775 rooms to hide it in. We have one bedroom, one car, one bathroom mirror at midnight. But the ache is the same size. Here's a question worth sitting with. Why do we hide our pain from the people closest to us? Not strangers, not the internet, the people who actually love us. Psychologists have a name for part of this. It's called impression management, the constant, mostly unconscious effort to control how others see us. We think of it as something only actors do, or politicians, or royals in front of cameras. But you do it every day. At work, you manage the impression of being competent, even on days you feel completely lost. With friends, you manage the impression of being fine, even when you're not. With family, you manage the impression of having it figured out, even when nothing feels figured out at all. This isn't dishonesty, it's survival. Because somewhere along the way, most of us learned a quiet, painful lesson. Showing weakness has a cost. Maybe you learned it as a kid, when you cried and someone told you to stop being dramatic. Maybe you learned it at work, when you admitted a mistake and it got used against you later. Maybe you learned it in a relationship, when you were vulnerable and it wasn't handled gently. So you adapted, you built a version of yourself that performs well, that looks calm, that looks capable. And slowly, without noticing, you started living inside that version more than inside yourself. That's the crown. Not gold, not jewels, just the invisible weight of always needing to look okay. Buckingham Palace is just this pattern, built in stone. Let's go deeper into where this pattern comes from. There's a concept in psychology called self-monitoring. It describes how much a person adjusts their behavior based on how they think others are perceiving them. High self-monitors are extremely good at reading a room and adjusting. Low self-monitors act more consistently, regardless of who's watching. Most of us shift somewhere in between, depending on the situation. But royalty lives in an extreme version of high self-monitoring, every single day, for their entire lives. Every gesture is interpreted. A yawn during a ceremony becomes a headline about boredom. A tired expression becomes a headline about a family crisis. A genuine laugh becomes evidence of scandal if the moment is wrong. Imagine never being allowed an off day, not one. Now here's the uncomfortable connection. Social media has quietly put a smaller version of that pressure on almost everyone. You post a photo, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you're already imagining how it will be read. Will it look like you're trying too hard? Will it look like you're doing better than you actually are? Will someone screenshot it? We didn't inherit crowns, but many of us inherited an audience. And an audience changes behavior every single time. There's a classic idea from sociology called the front stage and the backstage. The front stage is where we perform for others, polished, careful, aware we're being watched. The backstage is where we can drop the performance completely. For most people, home is the backstage, the place where the mask comes off. For someone living inside Buckingham Palace, there is almost no backstage left. Staff are present. Security is present. History is present, watching from the portraits on the walls, reminding you what's expected of someone in your position. Even sleep isn't fully private. Even grief gets scheduled around public duties. Now think about your own life for a second. Where is your backstage? Is it still a place you can fully drop the performance? Or has it slowly become another stage, just with a smaller audience? Because here's the pattern psychologists keep finding, in study after study. The less backstage a person has, the more emotional exhaustion they carry. Not because their problems are bigger, because they never get anywhere to safely put them down. There's a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. It's the tiredness of constantly managing how you appear. Therapists sometimes call it emotional labor when it happens in relationships or at work. It's the invisible effort of regulating your face, your tone, your words, so that others feel comfortable even when you don't. Royal historians have written about this exact exhaustion inside the palace. Advisors have described monarchs who, in private, seemed almost relieved to simply sit in silence for a few minutes, because it was the only time they weren't required to represent anything. Not a person, a symbol. A symbol doesn't get to have a bad day. But here's the deeper psychological cost, and this applies far beyond palace walls. When you spend enough years performing strength, you can start to lose access to your actual feelings. It's called emotional suppression, and long-term studies on it are honestly a little unsettling. People who consistently suppress emotion, rather than express or process it, show higher rates of anxiety and even physical symptoms like tension, fatigue, and stomach issues. The body keeps a record, even when the face doesn't show it. This is probably why so many royal biographies mention sudden, unexplained illnesses among monarchs during periods of personal crisis. Historians used to write it off as coincidence or the poor medicine of the time. Modern psychology offers a more likely explanation. Suppressed emotion doesn't disappear, it just changes location, from the mind to the body. Have you noticed this in your own life? The week you were most stressed and suddenly got sick. The relationship ending you never fully talked about, and the way your shoulders still tense up years later at a familiar song. Feelings that don't get expressed don't vanish. They just move house. Here's where this story starts to shift. Because underneath all the performing, all the self-monitoring, all the emotional labor, there is one thing every human being actually needs. Royalty included. Not admiration, not applause. Recognition. The simple, quiet experience of being truly seen by another person, without needing to perform anything for them. Psychologist Carl Rogers spent decades studying this and called it unconditional positive regard. The experience of being accepted, fully, without conditions attached. Most people go entire years without fully experiencing it. Because true recognition, requires two things that are surprisingly rare: someone willing to see you honestly, and you willing to stop performing long enough to be seen. Queen Victoria found a small piece of this, historians believe, in her relationship with a servant named John Brown, who reportedly spoke to her with unusual honesty, without the careful formality everyone else used. It scandalized the court. Not because anything improper happened, but because an honest conversation, without performance, was almost unheard of inside those walls. That tells you something important. We're often more comfortable with polished distance than we are with honest closeness. Because honest closeness requires risk. It means someone might see the parts of you that aren't polished, and loving those parts anyway. That's the real hunger hiding underneath 775 rooms of gold. Not more space, not more comfort. Just one room with one person where the crown finally comes off. Let's bring this out of the palace and into your world, because that's really where this story matters. In relationships. Think about the moments you've held back from a partner, not lied, just edited, smoothed over the rough edge of a feeling so it wouldn't cause friction. I'm fine when you weren't. It's okay when it really wasn't. Small performances, repeated enough times, start to feel like the relationship itself. And then, one day, you look at someone you've been with for years and realize they know your schedule, your preferences, your habits perfectly. But they don't know what actually keeps you up at night. That's not their failure. It's usually a quiet agreement neither person meant to make. A pact to keep things comfortable rather than real. In friendships. Notice how many friendships survive entirely on the surface. You talk about work, plans, shows you're watching, rarely about fear, rarely about the thing you're most ashamed of. Maybe you've had one friend, at some point, who you could actually be a mess in front of. No performance required. If you've lost touch with that person, there's probably a small ache attached to that. Not just missing them, missing the version of you that got to exist around them. At work. This one is almost universal. The workplace is built on performance. You learn early which emotions are professional and which ones aren't. Frustration gets rebranded as feedback. Exhaustion gets hidden behind, "I'm just really busy right now." Doubt gets buried under confident language in meetings, even when your hands are shaking under the table. Here's the quiet cost of this. Studies on workplace authenticity have found something worth remembering. Employees who feel they can't express their real selves at work report significantly higher burnout, even when their actual workload isn't heavier than their peers. It's not the work that exhausts you. It's the performing. In families. Maybe the most complicated one, because family is where the earliest scripts get written. Who gets to be upset? Who has to stay calm? Who plays the strong one no matter what? Adult children often walk back into their childhood home and instantly slip back into an old role, even if they've changed enormously since then. The oldest sibling still manages everyone's mood. The peacemaker still avoids conflict at any cost. The difficult one still braces for judgment before they've even said a word. Family systems therapists call these roles surprisingly sticky because they formed early under real emotional stakes, and the nervous system doesn't easily let them go. In personal growth. And this is maybe the most important one, because it's the one entirely in your control. A lot of self-improvement, honestly, becomes another performance, a polished version of growth for others to witness, the visible workout, the visible discipline, the visible glow-up. Real growth is quieter than that. It looks like sitting with an uncomfortable feeling instead of numbing it. It looks like admitting to yourself first that something isn't working. It looks like choosing honesty over image, even when nobody's there to give you credit for it. That kind of growth doesn't photograph well. but it's the only kind that actually changes anything. Here's something that might surprise you. The Stoics lived surrounded by exactly this kind of pressure: palace intrigue, public image, the constant demand to appear composed. Marcus Aurelius wasn't just a philosopher, he was a Roman emperor. He knew, intimately, what it felt like to be watched by an empire, expected to project strength every single day, whether he felt it or not. In his private journal, later published as Meditations, he wrote something that reads almost like a private confession. He reminded himself, again and again, to stop caring so much about the opinions of others, and to return instead to his own inner compass. That journal wasn't written for an audience. That's exactly why it matters. It was one of the only places in his life where the performance stopped. Here's the idea in plain language. The Stoics believed that peace doesn't come from controlling how others see you. It comes from controlling how you see yourself. Epictetus, who was born into slavery before becoming one of history's great philosophers, taught something that applies directly here. He said that people are disturbed not by events themselves, but by the meaning they attach to those events. Applied to our story, it's not being watched that exhausts you. It's believing that their opinion defines your worth. Once you separate those two things, something loosens. Seneca wrote to a friend once about the difference between solitude and loneliness. He believed a person could be completely alone and at peace, or completely surrounded by people and desperately lonely. The difference wasn't the number of people in the room. It was whether you had made peace with yourself. That's the peace Queen Victoria was reaching for in her silence, not isolation, a kind of internal honesty she couldn't access anywhere else. That's the peace George IV never found in his beautiful, empty Chinese room, because a room can't give you what only self-honesty can. Here's a genuinely useful Stoic tool for this exact problem. It's called the view from above. Marcus Aurelius used to imagine looking down at his life from a great height, watching himself, the empire, the palace, all of it, shrink into something small and temporary. It wasn't meant to make him feel insignificant. It was meant to loosen his grip on other people's opinions by remembering how briefly any of it actually lasts. Try it for a second, right now. Picture whatever's been weighing on you lately, the way you looked in a meeting, what someone might think of your choices, the performance you've been maintaining. Now imagine floating just slightly above it, watching yourself from a small distance. Notice how much smaller it feels already. That's not denial, that's perspective. And perspective, more than any palace, is where real peace actually lives. Understanding this pattern is one thing, living differently is another, so let's make this practical. Find one backstage. Not a hobby, not a distraction. One relationship, or even one journal where nothing needs to be managed. Where a bad day can just be a bad day without editing. This might be a therapist, a close friend, a private notebook you never intend to show anyone. It doesn't matter which. What matters is that it exists and that you actually use it instead of just knowing it's there. Practice small honesty before big honesty. You don't need to have a dramatic, tearful confession to start being real. Start smaller. Next time someone asks how you are, try answering with one honest sentence instead of the automatic, "Good, you." Honestly, a bit tired this week. That's it, that's the whole practice. Small, honest moments rebuild the muscle. Big honesty gets easier once the small kind feels normal again. Notice your own front stage. For one day, just notice. Notice when you're performing competence you don't feel. Notice when you're smiling past something. You don't have to change it immediately. Just build the awareness first. Awareness is what Marcus Aurelius was doing every night in that journal. Not fixing everything. Just noticing, honestly, what actually happened inside him that day. Separate the opinion from the fact. Next time you catch yourself spiraling over what someone might think, pause and ask, Is this actually true, or is this just a fear dressed up as a fact? Epictetus would call this examining your judgments. Most of what exhausts us isn't the event itself, it's the story we've quietly attached to it. Let one thing be imperfect on purpose. Send the email with a small typo instead of proofreading it 5 times. Show up to the gathering without the perfect outfit. Let a friend see the messy version of your apartment. Small, deliberate imperfection is a rehearsal. It teaches your nervous system that the world doesn't end when the performance slips. Build your own quiet room. You don't need 775 rooms. You need one. A physical space, or even just 10 minutes where no one requires anything from you, where you're not a parent, an employee, or anyone's anything. Just a person breathing for 10 quiet minutes. Protect that time the way royalty should have protected theirs, and rarely did. Buckingham Palace still stands, gold and enormous, on the same ground it always has. Tourists still photograph the gates. Guards still change with the same practiced precision. But somewhere behind all that grandeur, generations of people quietly learned the same lesson, over and over. No amount of space fixes an unspoken feeling. No amount of comfort replaces being truly seen. And no crown, no title, no perfect room ever fully protects you from the simple, human need to put the performance down sometimes. You don't live in a palace. You probably don't have staff or portraits or an entire country watching your every move. But you carry a version of the same weight, the edited version of yourself you show people, the room in your life where you finally let it go. Maybe today, that room gets a little bigger. Maybe today, one honest sentence replaces one automatic "I'm fine." That's enough, that's actually enough. Peace was never going to arrive in a bigger house. It arrives in a smaller moment, a held breath let go, a truth spoken out loud to someone safe. You don't need 775 rooms. You just need one where you finally stop performing. If this felt like it understood you a little too well, subscribe. New episodes like this drop every week. And if you know someone who's been performing fine for a little too long, send them this one.